the ancient wonder that was deliberately erased from history. Somewhere in Thebes, about 3,000 years ago, a man climbs a scaffold with a chisel and starts scraping a face off a temple wall. He's not a vandal, he's following orders from the king. And he's not alone. This is happening at temples up and down the Nile for years on the direct order of the Pharaoh, an organized, methodical campaign to erase one specific person from Egyptian history. Not a criminal, not a foreign enemy. A former pharaoh who happened to be a woman, who ruled successfully for over 20 years and built one of the most audacious temples in human history, and then, for the better part of 3,000 years, almost nobody knew her name. Her name was Hatshepsut. Here's the part that should bother you more than the vandalism does. The erasure almost worked. It's only failing right now, because the people who ordered it were worse at their job than they realized. Let's set the board. Around 1479 BCE, Egypt's pharaoh, Thutmose II, died young. His heir, Thutmose III, was a small child, too small to run an empire, so Hatshepsut, the boy's aunt and stepmother, stepped in as regent. That part wasn't unusual. Egypt had done this before. A capable woman holding the throne steady until the boy grows up, then handing it back. Everyone expects a temporary arrangement. Hatshepsut did not treat it as temporary. Within a few years, she wasn't just running the country in the young king's name. She was crowned pharaoh in her own right, full royal titulary, the crook and flail, the false beard. In statues and reliefs, she starts appearing dressed and posed as a male king because that's what the office demanded visually. Egypt's kingship was coded male, and Hatshepsut didn't fight that code. She put it on like armor. And here's the detail most retellings skip past. Thutmose III didn't disappear. He was still alive, still titled king, still growing up in the palace, while his aunt ran the country as senior co-ruler for roughly 2 decades. 2 pharaohs on paper, one with actual power. That's already a strange arrangement. What she built with that power is stranger. Hatshepsut's mortuary temple sits against the cliffs at Deir el-Bahri, on the west bank of the Nile near Luxor. The Egyptians called it Djeser, Holy of Holies. Picture 3 enormous terraces, cut directly into the rock, connected by long ramps, colonnades lined with statues, gardens planted with imported trees. It doesn't look like most Egyptian temples you're picturing right now. It looks almost modern, clean horizontal lines against a dead-flat cliff face, like the mountain grew architecture. It was also a giant piece of political theater carved in stone. The temple's walls tell her story exactly the way she wanted it told, that the god Amun himself chose her, in disguise, to father her, making her divinely legitimate, not just administratively convenient. And then there's the expedition to Punt. Sometime during her reign, Hatshepsut sent a fleet south along the Red Sea to Punt, a trading region generally placed somewhere around modern Somalia, Eritrea, or the Horn of Africa more broadly, though its exact location is still debated among historians. The ships came back loaded with myrrh trees, ebony, gold, exotic animals, incense. She had the entire voyage carved into her temple walls in enormous, boastful detail, one of the most complete depictions of an ancient Egyptian trade expedition that survives anywhere. There's a small, almost eerie postscript to that. At the temple site today, there's still a withered tree stump, reportedly one of the actual myrrh trees planted from that expedition 3,500 years ago. It's outlived the empire that planted it. By any measure, this was one of the most successful reigns in Egyptian history. Stable, wealthy, architecturally ambitious in a way Egypt hadn't attempted in centuries. So why did the next generation try to erase it? Hatshepsut died around 1458 BCE. Thutmose III, now a grown man, an experienced military commander, finally became sole pharaoh. For a while nothing happens, no purge. Her monuments stand untouched for years. Then late in Thutmose III's reign, Egyptologists estimate roughly 2 decades after Hatshepsut's death, the erasure begins. Her cartouches, the oval rings that enclosed a pharaoh's name, get chiseled off temple walls and replaced with the names of Thutmose I, Thutmose II, or Thutmose III himself. Reliefs showing her performing kingly rituals get her image cut out entirely. On one relief at Karnak, you can still see faint ghost traces underneath the replacement. The sun disk from her original name was never fully scraped away, so if you know where to look, her erased identity is technically still visible under the edit. Statues of her as king were dragged out, smashed, and buried in a pit and a nearby quarry near her temple. And here's the detail that tells you this wasn't random vandalism, it was surgical. Images of Hatshepsut as queen regent from the early part of her rule were mostly left alone. It was specifically her identity as king, the crown, the false beard, the full royal titulary that got targeted. Whoever ordered this wasn't trying to erase a person, they were trying to erase a claim. For most of the 20th century, the standard explanation was personal revenge. A stepson, humiliated for 20 years by an aunt who took the throne he was supposedly owed, finally getting even once she was safely dead. It's a great story. It's also, according to more recent evidence, probably not the full picture. Two things have come out of Egyptology in the last few years that mess with the tidy revenge narrative, and this is the part most videos on this topic skip entirely. First, the timing doesn't fit vengeance neatly. If Thutmose III hated Hatshepsut enough to erase her, why wait roughly 20 years after her death to start? Some historians now argue the destruction campaign actually accelerates around the time Thutmose elevates his own son, Amenhotep II, to co-regent, meaning the person with the strongest motive to erase evidence of a woman successfully claiming kingship wasn't the bitter stepson at all. It was the next generation, securing a smooth, unambiguous male succession before the old king died, not revenge, insurance. Second, and this one's newer, from 2025, a study published in the journal Antiquity, based on a fresh look at unpublished excavation records from the 1920s, re-examined exactly how Hatshepsut's statues were broken. The traditional story says Thutmose's men smashed them out of hatred. But the fracture pattern tells a different story. Breaks concentrated at the neck, the waist, the knees, weak points consistent with a known Egyptian ritual practice called deactivation, used on royal statues generally, not a chaotic revenge smashing unique to Hatshepsut. In other words, some of what looks like an act of hatred might actually have been standard procedure for retiring a former king's statues, just applied, in Hatshepsut's case, alongside a genuinely unusual and targeted campaign to erase her kingship from the written record. Both things can be true at once. The name erasure looks deliberate and personal. The statue damage might be more mundane than the legend suggests. Egyptology hasn't fully settled this, and honestly, it might never fully settle it. That ambiguity is the actual state of the evidence, not a cop-out, just where the field currently stands. One thing everyone agrees on, though, it didn't work. Here's the irony sitting at the center of this whole story. In 1922, a team from the Metropolitan Museum of Art, led by archaeologist Herbert Winlock, started clearing the ground near Hatshepsut's temple. Over the next several years, they found two major deposits, a pit near the temple that excavators nicknamed the Hatshepsut Hole, and a nearby stone quarry, both stuffed with smashed fragments of her statues, thrown away almost 3,500 years earlier. Thousands of broken pieces. Winlock's team spent years piecing them back together like an enormous stone jigsaw puzzle, in at least one case reuniting a statue's body, found in Egypt with its head, which had been sitting in a Berlin museum since a completely separate excavation nearly 80 years earlier. And because Hatshepsut's monuments were smashed and buried rather than reused as building material, which is what usually happened to a discarded pharaoh's leftover stone, more statues survive of Hatshepsut today than of almost any other Egyptian ruler. The people who tried to erase her accidentally preserved her better than if they'd simply left her alone. Her name erasure had a second, unplanned failure too. Not every trace was hidden. One of her obelisks at Karnak was walled up rather than torn down, essentially encased inside a later structure. Walling something up preserves it, which means somewhere in that decision-making process, 3,000 years ago, somebody chose concealment over destruction. We don't know why. But it meant that obelisk survived intact, hidden in plain sight for millennia. By the 20th century, Egyptologists piecing the fragments back together weren't just reconstructing statues. They were reconstructing a reign that generations of ancient scribes had worked hard to make disappear. So here's where it lands. Somebody, a bitter stepson, or a pragmatic grandson securing a throne, or possibly both, layered across two reigns, spent enormous effort trying to remove a woman's claim to kingship from Egypt's official memory. They chiseled her name off walls, they smashed her statues and threw them in a hole in the ground. They gave her accomplishments to other men's cartouches. And today, Hatshepsut has more surviving statues than almost any pharaoh in Egyptian history, a temple still standing against a cliff face after 3,500 years, and her own myrrh trees stump still rooted in the ground where she planted it. The erasure is part of her story now too. You can't tell you one without the other. Which maybe raises the more unsettling question, not about Hatshepsut, but about everyone we didn't find a Hatshepsut hole for, every pharaoh who got erased properly, quietly, completely, no pit of broken statues for some archaeologist to dig up in 1922. We only know about this one because they were bad at it. If you want to know what else got quietly written out of history, you know where the subscribe button is.